Okay, I think we're good to go. I know we'll have uh, uh, folks that will still be coming through, and I wanted to, if I can, just to offer a good morning and a good afternoon to those that are joining on both sides of the Atlantic and in Ukraine today. So thank you so much. My name is Jonathan Katz. I'm a senior advisor and fellow on Ukraine and civil society at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I want to welcome you to today's event focused on Ukraine, 1 year after the start of Russia and Vladimir Putin's unjust and unprovoked full-scale invasion. Today's anniversary is also a moment to recognize the Ukrainian people, their bravery, heroism, determination, and unrelenting fight for sovereignty, freedom, democracy, and independence. The Ukrainian people, by their actions and resolve, remind us every day why the world must stand with Ukraine. Before turning to our speakers and opening remarks, I want to thank our partners and co-organizers who are the true force and leaders behind this event, and who over the past several months have led their own impactful and respective efforts to support Ukraine and the Ukrainian people and to address the global impacts of this conflict. I want to thank co-organizers Philanthropy Europe Association, PHILEA, Community Foundations of Canada, Philanthropic Foundations Canada, Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, U.S. Council on Foundations, German Marshall Fund of the United States, European Community Foundation Initiative, and PEX Community. There are so many of you that have worked together to support Ukraine, and it's important to highlight everyone who contributed to today's event. I also want to welcome and thank our keynote speaker, Ukrainian Nobel Peace Laureate, Alexandra Matvichuk. Thank you so much for joining us today and what I know is an extremely busy and somber occasion. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. I want to remind everyone who's joining today that this event is on the record. We will have a question and answer period that will take place in the latter half of this conversation. To facilitate questions, we'll be using the chat box, which you can find if you've been on Zoom. You know it's at the base of the screen. Please feel free throughout the entire conversation to put questions in the chat box. We'll get to that during the Q&A period. But please use it. You can pose a question. My colleague Martina Herblova will be joining us at that point, my JMF colleague, to help us with that and to lead us through the Q&A session as well. Turning to our speakers, just as the transatlantic community, the public and private sectors have come together to support Ukraine over the past 12 months, so has philanthropy on both sides of the Atlantic, so shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. And many new pledges, even this week, and the lead up to the anniversary of this conflict, have also pledged to provide new assistance. I want to turn to Delphine Morales, who is the Chief Executive Officer at PHILEA, and Natalie Ross, who's the Vice President for Membership, Development, and Finance at the Council on Foundations. Delphine, I'm going to turn to you first, just for your opening statement, and then Natalie, I'll turn to you. There's so much ground to cover. I just highlighted that this is an extraordinary community on both sides of the Atlantic that has come together to support Ukraine. Delphine, if I can just turn it over to you for your opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you to all of you for joining us today, but also for joining us in many of the convenings that have been organized on both sides of the Atlantics with Ukrainian partners to stand in solidarity to those affected by this war. In these opening statements for today's meetings, Natalie and I wanted to put a couple of things into context, starting by going back to the atrocities that have been committed since the 24th of February last year. While numbers reveal much less than the actual suffering, we wanted to give you some of the highlights of the situation and the state of play today. According to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, close to 19,000 civilian casualties, including over 7,000 deaths, have been counted. But we know, in fact, that the actual figure on the Ukrainian side is much higher than what has been accounted for in this data. We also know that nearly 6 million Ukrainians have been internally displaced, and that 8.1 million have fled as refugees, according to the UNHCR, and that the percentage of children living in poverty has almost doubled to more than 80% in 1 year time. The damage to building and infrastructure amounts to nearly 136 billion US dollar, according to the Kiev School of Economics. And this is what we know from the situation in Ukraine today. But we also know that the ripple effects of the attacks go globally. They go globally in the sense that food supplies and energy supplies have been affected dramatically, with the 20% highest at risk countries for new humanitarian emergencies seeing food price inflations at almost 40% as a direct result of the war. And in terms of energy, we're seeing that 70 million people who recently gained access to electricity can at this stage no longer afford it. So the attacks go far beyond the dramatic impact of the invasion in Ukraine itself. And it is estimated that 349 million people across 79 countries are to experience acute food insecurity in 2023. With that, I'd like to turn over to Natalie to say a few words about how philanthropy has responded to the situation. But before doing that, it is important to note that solidarity has come first and foremost from the communities in Ukraine and around the region. It is noted and documented that it is thanks to the network of independent civil society organizations that have come to the fore immediately that lives have been saved and that structures have been safeguarded. And according to a recent report on charity at times of war, we know that today 85% of the population in Ukraine increases, which is a big increase compared to what was done in the past. And that the giving of Ukrainians has also increased in terms of the numbers of and the amount of solidarity. So an increase of 20% of giving in Ukraine itself. So over to you, Natalie, to shed a light on the overall picture from the philanthropic sector.
Thank you, Delphine. And I'm honored to talk a little bit about what we know and have tracked about philanthropic response globally to the crisis in Ukraine. So this data comes from Candid, a data philanthropy network here in the United States. They've tracked that 2.79 billion US dollars has even been made in grants or pledged by philanthropy towards the crisis. And notably, as we've said throughout these opening remarks, that support has been worldwide. So we see solidarity from all regions of the world to provide philanthropic support to the crisis in Ukraine, with 67% coming from the Americas and 28% from Europe and the rest around the world. Notably, this is just one data source. We know it is not fully complete. So it is one picture of what we can see about the philanthropic response. We've also know that a lot of these grants and pledges were made at the beginning of the crisis. 72% were made between February and July. So there has been a slowing of large philanthropic gifts in the second half of this year. And notably, corporate philanthropy contributed over 50% of these grants and pledges. Also of note is that recent studies have shown that a relatively small amount of this $2.79 billion has flowed to Ukrainian civil society. And so in both of our networks with Philea and the US Council on Foundations, we've really been talking with our partners and helping support them to think about how they can invest in local civil society in the region and build their resilience and support. From this data, one of the largest grantees, as an example, is an international organization based in the US, the World Central Kitchen, which has received almost $30 million for their response in Ukraine. So the data paints an interesting picture, both of a large scale of dollars that have been earmarked and set aside for response in Ukraine, the majority immediately following the start of the crisis, which is a normal pattern we see in disaster philanthropy that has slowed, and yet we know that there's long-term rebuilding in the region and a need to support civil society. I'm also happy to share what the Council has been doing here in the US with foundations on this crisis. So we've been partnering with philanthropy peers in Canada to convene North American funders around how they are continuing to respond to the situation in Ukraine. They've been learning together from Ukrainian experts and partners around the world to really strengthen their response. We also have been working at the council. We are a network that is 40% community foundations, and know that there is a robust and growing community and network of community foundations in the region. And so have been working to support those regional community foundations. The Berks County Community Foundation in Pennsylvania, who I believe is on the call with us today, has been hosting a fund for US donors to channel resources to Adnania in the region and support local community foundations. We also know that in North America, there's been local engagement with Ukrainian diaspora and support for refugees. And like Philea and others, we've been working to curate the types of resources that funders need to respond in the crisis, especially funders who don't have previous experience funding in the region, so that they can partner with trusted organizations.
Thank you, Natalie. And similarly in Europe, the philanthropic community has come together quite quickly after the invasion of Ukraine, with the first of 12 meetings on philanthropy for Ukraine launched on the 4th of March, attended over the past 12 months by over 260 philanthropic leaders, really to learn from what has happened in the region, to speak with experts and understand how we can support, focusing first on making sense of the situation, but then increasingly trying to understand the situation of children in the region, the situation of researchers, the impact of the war on global food supply, the needs in terms of reconstruction, and the need of support for civil society. Also, in the first rapid onset crisis, early March, a website was created by Philea where a total of 176 million euros were pledged within a couple of months, obviously not representing the larger amounts that have been pledged or already granted by the philanthropic community, but shedding a light into some of the specific areas of work that our philanthropic community has wanted to support, with 60% of that funding being directed to humanitarian aid, 10% to refugee supports, 10% to arts and culture, and 7% to education. And with as an aim to connect between the philanthropic world and the needs of those on the ground, we also created a website which collected calls for support from 122 local and international organizations working in Ukraine and beyond. And with that, similarly to what has been done in the US, we have also been collecting recommendations, resources from those affected, from civil society organizations and experts on the ground, but also those who work in those very specific and complex situations of war and humanitarian crisis, to understand where philanthropy can really play a role. And as is the case in many of these crises, we have learned and heard that supporting civil society in the country is of essential importance, and that philanthropy can also play a very important role on the long term, rather than only at the early beginnings of the crisis. We've been connecting with European organizations, with European decision makers, to make sure that we understand what the European developments were and how we can engage between the philanthropic sector and the EU. And last but not least, we have also seen many of our members contributing to pooled funds. On the one hand, existing pooled funds, for instance, through the European Programme on Integration and Migration, which has set up a dedicated fund targeting specifically those affected by the war, but also, for instance, the Culture of Solidarity Now, which has created a special edition for the war in Ukraine. So these are some of the examples in how, as a community, we have come together, we have convened, we have listened to those affected with the aim of supporting more and supporting better. And over the past weeks, as you have registered for the session that we're organizing today, we have also asked you for your views on where you stand and where you would like us to go next. And shedding in light on what we have learned from you, we know that according to your responses, foundations and philanthropic organizations continue to stand in solidarity with Ukraine. In fact, according to the 85 people that took the effort of responding to our questionnaire, we know that 42% of you have allocated funding for Ukraine in line with the existing geographic and thematic focus of the organization. So you stick to your mission, you stick to your priorities, but in those priorities are able to allocate funding to the Ukraine situation. 18% of you have revised their strategy and added new programs, new portfolios to be prepared for situations such as these in the future. And 13% of the respondents have created an emergency fund. We've also asked you whether when you earmarked funding to support Ukraine in 2023, you had specific areas of focus. And there we see that the priority goes to civil society strengthening, to the protection and support of temporarily displaced people, moving on to a continued investment in humanitarian assistance, to a support for infrastructure, for independent media and journalism. And some of you also earmarking funding for post-war recovery. We've also asked about your interests and dedication to the longer-term support for Ukraine. And in deciding where longer-term support would be targeted, the majority, or more than half of you, have reported having an interest in civil society strengthening. There has also been a keen interest in continuing longer-term support for infrastructure and reconstruction, for building democracy in the country and in the region, for the cultural recovery of Ukraine, for healthcare, and for agriculture and food security. We have also asked which key characteristics were emerging in terms of philanthropy's response to crisis. And there we see that collaboration is one of the key approaches that you believe are essential in dealing with crisis and having a philanthropic response that helps in crisis situation. Also important is flexibility, agility, resilience, cultural sensitivity, proximity has also been noted, and innovation. And with that, we see that philanthropy has indeed come to the fore in supporting those affected by the crisis. And at the end of the conversation today, we will be calling upon you to join us in signing a statement of solidarity for Ukraine, a statement that has been drafted in consultation with our Ukrainian partners, and that really expresses how philanthropy stands united in this very important moment in the history of Ukraine, of Europe, and of the world. And let me with this hand over back to you, Jonathan, so that we can have a conversation with experts from the region.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for that far-reaching and sort of better understanding what philanthropy has done, and it's quite extraordinary and evolving, as you both highlight. And thank you for the survey information, because I think it gives an idea, an understanding of the direction where philanthropy is going. I want to bring in Alexandra Mapachuk into the conversation right now. And if I can, I just want to read just a brief bio of Alexandra, and thank you so much for joining us today. Alexandra is a leading human rights defender who works on issues in Ukraine and the OSCE region. At present, she heads the human rights organization Center for Civil Liberties and also coordinates the work of the initiative group Euromaidan SOS. The activities of the Center for Civil Liberties are aimed at protecting human rights and establishing democracy in Ukraine and across the region. After the beginning of the new Russian armed aggression in February 2022, Alexandra, together with other partners, created the Tribunal for Putin initiative to document international crimes under the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court in all regions of Ukraine, which became the targets of attacks of the Russian Federation. In 2016, she received the Democracy Defender Award for exclusive contributions to promoting democracy and human rights from missions to the OSCE. In 2022, Alexandra was awarded with the Right Livelihood Award and recognized as one of the 25th influential women in the world by the Financial Times. The same year, Center for Civil Liberties, which Alexandra heads, received the Nobel Peace Prize. We are really deeply appreciative for you joining us today. I didn't read your full bio, but it's quite extraordinary. I want to hand the floor over to you on this day, and I think you've had an opportunity to hear from Delphine and Natalie, but we want to turn the floor over to you to get your remarks as well. Over to you, Alexandra.
Thank you very much for providing me a floor. I would like to start with sincere gratitude for solidarity and support which Ukraine obtained during this dramatic time of our history. Today is a year of large-scale invasion, and this year resulted in numerous war crimes, and we document how Russian troops deliberately shell in residential buildings, schools, churches, hospitals, attack evacuation corridors, manage filtration camps system, organize forcible deportations, commit murders, tortures, rapes, abductions, and other kinds of offenses against civilians. I would like to touch in my introductory speech several points, and I would like to speak about recovery, about democratic transformation, about role of international organizations and donors organizations, and about power of people. I know that it's very difficult to speak about recovery in war times, but it's too late to discuss this after the war will end. And when people talk about recovery, first of all, they imagine the restoration of ruined bridges, ruined residential buildings, ruined roads, and other civil objects and civil infrastructure. This is important and essential, but persons affected by the war are also has to be one of priority of the recovery process. It means that when we thinking about recovery, we have to think about some crimes survivor support programs, which have to include the compensatory mechanism for property losses, psychological and medical assistance. We have to think about support opportunities for internally displaced person and from people returning to the destroyed territories. We need to implement some development projects for local communities to return the breath to local economy. And also we have to think and should address natural environment restoration and protection issues. So there are a lot of questions which are in the table when we speak about recovery. Russians destroyed the critical civil infrastructure in order to leave millions of Ukrainians without water, heat, electricity, internet connection, and other kind of basic facilities during this winter. But it's provide opportunity to implement the program of green recovery, and we have to think about it. Also, the question of education. We still live in total uncertainty because you never know when the air alarm started or internet and electricity will disappear, and how to ensure the right for education, how to transform the educational process and support it in all levels from kindergarten till university. It's also a question. The same important issue is healthcare. Millions of people suffering, and we speak not only about diseases or some injuries. We speak about huge psychological trauma, which has to be overcome in the future. The question is what we will do with Ukrainian agriculture. Unfortunately, Ukraine become one of the most polluted by mines state in the world, and this is the critical issue, how we can develop agriculture in such circumstances, and also how to support low private sector in a situation when a lot of Ukrainian business lost their activities after the large-scale Russian invasion. But second issue which I want to stress, it's a democratic transformation, because when we speak about recovery, we have also include the creation and reforming of democratic sustainable institutions. I would like to remind that this war started not in February 2022, but in February 2014, when Ukraine obtained a chance for the quick democratic transformation after collapse of authoritarian regime as a result of revolution of dignity. And in order to stop us on this way, Putin started this war 9 years ago because Putin is not afraid of NATO. Putin is afraid of the idea of freedom. And this war has a very vivid value dimension. In this regard, is not just a war between two states. This is a war between two systems, authoritarianism and democracy. And now Putin tried to convince Ukrainians that we made a wrong choice 9 years ago when we organized peaceful protest against authoritarian regime and struggle for freedom and for democracy, because he tried to demonstrate that democracy, rule of law, and human rights are fake values and couldn't protect you during the war. So we have to make a response for this claim and to win this value dimension of this war. And it's also part of recovery process, because when we speak about democratic transformation of the country, it's not enough to adopt equality laws or create a new formal institutions, because the energy and non-formal values of society will prevail. And we need to restore not only Ukrainian infrastructure, we need to restore the belief of Ukrainian people that rule of law is essential, democracy is working, and justice is possible, even though delay in time. And the most crucial in this regard is a question of justice. I will refer to the sociological survey, which was conducted last year. Ukrainians were asked, what will be the main disappointment for you when the war ends? And majority of Ukrainians, 65 and 8%, responded that the main disappointment for them will be the impunity for Russian war crimes. So this is demand for justice of millions of people, and we can't ignore it. And it's very important to support efforts of national investigative bodies, international investigative bodies, as well as civil society and other actors to ensure justice for all victims of this war. Second point, which I want to touch, is the role of international organizations and donors organizations, and generally what was a philanthropic response to the large-scale invasion. Because large-scale invasion raise a lot of urgent questions also for these stakeholders: how to accumulate resources quickly, how to use them effectively, and how to spend these resources to the real needs of Ukrainian people. And this provokes some organizations to change their procedures and their rules, but some of them haven't changed it, which lead to the additional burden to their local partners who work in Ukraine and ineffective using their resources. What do I mean? When people need water, and they need water now, and they have no time to wait when some international organization or some UN agencies, like UN agencies or someone else, will provide a tender according all procedures and reach all indicators of transparency. And then after some period of time, 1 week or even more, provide this water to people. These procedures were elaborated for the normal situation. War is not normal situation. And war demanded not the well-developed procedures, because you live in total uncertainty and you can't calculate all details what appeared every day. The war situation needs courage. The war situation needs leadership. The war situation needs from the head of international and donors organizations to take a risk and in order to fulfill their goal. And unfortunately, we as Ukrainians were witness that some of organizations mostly focus on their internal documents, but not on the goals for what they was created for. And also, I would like to emphasize on something which is not maybe very visible when you are not in Ukraine. A lot of organizations have their local partners in Ukraine, majority of them in the form of civil society organizations. Someone work with volunteers initiatives or some non-formal groups. They are all active people, and active people during the wartime become in 3 times more active. In parallel to their main work, they do a lot of volunteers work to help the country to resist and to help people to survive. It means that they can't proceed the normal bureaucratic rules of the donors organizations, because these people have no normal life anymore. And last, what I want to focus is about power of people. When international organizations left the country, ordinary people remained, and ordinary people started to do extraordinary things. Ordinary people took people out through their ruined cities. Ordinary people broke encirclement to provide humanitarian aid. Ordinary people helped to survive under artillery's fires and took people, rescued people who trapped into the rubble of residential buildings. And I must admit that I would never wish any nation to go through the war, because war is something horrible. But this dramatic time provide Ukraine
Alexandra, can you hear us? Okay, I think we might just, and I know there are some challenges in terms of both internet and electricity and other things. So why don't we'll see if we can get Alexandra back on quickly and see if internet is working on her end. I'm gonna just try to sort of communicate with Alexandra. We give it about 30 seconds. Roberto, I don't know if you're okay. Why don't we while we wait for Alexandra to come back on, and obviously hearing from her was about the current situation, which I think obviously not a normal situation in any which way, and sort of how Ukrainians have stepped up in extraordinary ways, maybe sort of in ways that they probably had never thought that they would have to, and the role that's being played by civil society, which so many, even within the survey, said needs support and continued support, including in 2023. I thought maybe while we wait for Alexandra, and we have, I wanted to, to just bring in David Spergel, who is the president of the Simons Foundation. David, if we could bring David on too, and maybe just, and we'll be flexible. Oh, she is getting, okay, Delphine, thank you. And also please feel free, while we're waiting to think and pose questions in the chat box as well. Alexandra, thank you. Can you hear us?
Yes, I hear you. Sorry for this technical problem.
That's okay. The floor is yours again to continue. Thank you.
I will finish with my speech with this point that this approach has to be the focus on local communities, and the engaging of civil society as an equal partner of all process. Last year, civil society announced the Lugana Declaration on the rebuilding conference in Lugana, and it was our ambition to throw to Ukrainian authorities and to international partners that we take responsibility for development of the country to our own shoulders. And I will finish with a point that this war shows us that there are a lot of things which have no limitation in national borders, Human solidarity is one of such things, and freedom is one of such things. And I would like to thank you once again for this solidarity and for your support of fight of Ukrainian people for freedom and for democracy.
Alexandra, thank you, and thank you for filling us in both on sort of what's happening now, needs, but also, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions coming your way too about looking ahead and what, you know, what can we all do to support Ukraine and Ukrainians going forward. I wanted to turn to David Spergel right now, who's the president of the Simons Foundation. David, I'm sorry, I'm not going to read your full bio, just in we have just a short time, but I wanted to talk to you about your work in Ukraine, and I'm going to hand the floor over to you.
Well, it's an honor and privilege to follow Alexandra. We have long admired her courage and the courage of her colleagues in first bringing democracy to Ukraine and standing strong as democracy in their country is under threat. So let me begin by saying a bit about the Simons Foundation and the Simons Foundation International. We're a foundation set up to support basic research. Our mission is to advance the frontiers of research in mathematics and natural sciences. And that in some ways makes us far away from the day-to-day conflicts. But one of the things that I thought was an important part of our mission was supporting scientists in Ukraine and the scientists from Ukraine as many of them became refugees. We had a long-standing program of supporting the IIE Scholars Rescue Fund, but that was which we had done that before, February 2022, and when the invasion happened, the National Academy of Sciences here in the U.S. reached out to us and other large U.S. science philanthropies to ask us to support the Bulgarian and Polish Academies of Sciences, which were hosting refugees fleeing from the war, trying to continue their scientific research. And I felt that was an important first step in supporting Ukrainian scientists, but felt that the long-term support required that we find ways to support scientists working in Ukraine, and working and devising strategies to help Ukrainians rebuild their scientific institutions, their research centers, and their universities after the war. As I thought about our abilities to do this as a foundation, I thought about what our strengths were in addressing this. Primary one is thinking about ways consistent with our mission. We have associated with our foundation a research institute called the Flatiron Institute. At our research institute, we have a number of outstanding scientists in biology, chemistry, physics, mathematics, who came from Ukraine and the region and were familiar with it. Greg Abadadze, the director of our physics programs, grew up in Georgia and has family in Ukraine. So we had some insight into the scientific community there. We decided to set up a research program targeted at supporting researchers working in Ukraine. The program involves a $200 monthly stipend to PhD researchers, a $100 monthly stipend to PhD students to enable them to continue their work. Right now, we're supporting 400 researchers in Ukraine. And we'll be sending $1.2 million over the coming year. We see this as the first step. As long as the war continues, we hope to continue to support researchers in Ukraine, allow them to continue their work. And we're now thinking about, and I spoke with our board yesterday, and they are supporting our activities to think about how can we assist in the rebuilding. And as I think about rebuilding and strengthening Ukrainian scientific institutions and helping Ukrainian scientists in the coming years, I think about what is our strengths as a philanthropy. I think of the role of philanthropy is to supplement and complement work done by nation states. I think of government spending as paying one tune in, say, supporting science, but also in other areas. Our role is to sort of counterpunctual music. For those of you who know your music theory, we play a different tune that harmonizes it with it, complements it, makes it richer. Looking towards rebuilding Ukraine after the war, I am reasonably confident there'll be significant government support for rebuilding. I also suspect governments will move slowly. And I think that one of the things that we should be doing as philanthropies as we look forward to rebuilding after the war is think about ways in which we can go in quickly, go in flexibly. Something that I was very pleased with our grants team here is we were very flexible in our ways of getting money into places we haven't done so before. And no matter how we approach this, we will be coming at this thinking about the scientific communities. Others will come at this with their other missions. We need to think about ways in which we can flexibly assist in supporting Ukraine through this difficult time and then rebuilding and creating what will hopefully be a flourishing society that will be even richer than before the war. Thank you.
David, thank you for that too, and all the work that you and the foundation are doing. And thank you for bringing up rebuilding Ukraine, flexibility, short, medium, and longer term needs that will need to be addressed. I want to bring in Eva Kulik-Balinska, who's the executive director at the Stefan Battery Foundation. So great to see you. Thank you for being here. I'm going to hand the floor over to you to follow up after David's intervention, and then we'll pick up from there. So Eva, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, and congratulations, Alexandra, for the Nobel Prize. I was so happy to hear you got it. I'm so pleased to meet you in person, though not physically, but online. I prepared a different intervention, but after hearing what Alexandra said, I think I will start and echo some of the remarks that she made, because it seems to me that they are very important to be stressed, as they are valuable not only for Ukraine and people in Ukraine, but also of people from Ukraine who fled the war and are staying in other countries, including Poland. Role of international donors and role of the funders. I can only echo what you, Alexandra, said, and I believe this was something which my colleague Agnieszka Kosowicz from the Polish Migration Forum told you during the last meeting, how important it is to empower local people and local organizations, and especially civil society organizations. Alexandra mentioned about the Logan conference, we are often, when we speak about civil society, we see it as those organizations, charities that are providing immediate help. And of course, this immediate help is important and will continue to be important. But the civil society organizations are also important actors to provide and care for rule of law, democracy, anti-corruption, and to be on the guard, to be guardians of the democratic principles and democratic procedures. Ukraine is really exceptional in any aspect that you look at it right now. There is war there, and during war, often we tend to forget about democracy. Ukraine, and this is something we have to stress and emphasize, remains a democratic state, although it's in war. Democratic procedures are in place. Accountability, the powers are being held accountable. What manifestation of this is, for example, the corruption scandal that was disclosed, and that people who were involved in a corruption procedure were punished. And this is not only because of the authorities that are, but this is because of the civil society organizations that are still conducting their watchdog activity and that are vocal about the need to preserve democratic procedures and and hold their powers accountable. Lugano conference was important because it also showed the strength of the Ukrainian civil society in their advocacy powers and their powers to influence policy. In Lugano, it was not only the government, Ukrainian government, that presented plan for reconstruction and recovery, but also a group of the leading civil society organization. They proposed their own complementary vision of Ukraine after victory. They call it the Vision Ukraine 2030, and they supplemented this document with a manifest of values that should accompany reconstruction after the war ends. There is another important document that was adopted and prepared lately, and maybe not all of you heard about it because so many things were happening recently, that it's still to be disseminated and promoted. It is a document developed by the civil society of Ukraine, both the activists and public intellectuals and experts. It's called Never Again to Zero, Sustainable Peace Manifest. And it was presented in Munich Security Conference. And there are three, it's a huge document, but there is a summary that I would recommend to you and send it to you the link after this meeting. But there are three important elements there, and this is again something which I would like to echo after Alexandra. There's a need for justice, but there's a need for justice after the war, and the need of securing the future of Ukraine with Ukrainian people, not above, not beyond their heads. And I know what I say because we still remember in Poland the Yalta deal, and of many deals in which people involved were not being present. So there are three elements in this manifesto. One, what will be the status of Russia in future world? What should be the responsibilities for war crimes of Russian authorities, but also Russian society? And what future security architecture should look like, and what kind of structural fundaments it should have. I'm talking about it because we often tend as funders to think about ourselves as those who stay away from politics. We say that we are maybe we should be apart from it, we should not meddle. But I think the word today is, as Joe Biden said during his stay in Poland, today we have to make decisions, and we have to think that if we do not make certain decisions today, it will really impact our future. There is indeed a turning point in history with the Ukraine war. There is Zeitenwende, as the Germans say it. I mean, the world is not going to be the same again. And it's not only Ukraine that is at stake, it's really the global deal that is at stake. We have to act, and we have to act fast. So our role as funders is not only to provide immediate support to those who are in need. We still should to continue to do this, but our role is also to create platforms in which the Ukrainian voices are to be heard, and we have to make sure that we will be able to amplify their voices. Our role is also to facilitate the interaction with the Ukrainian civil society actors, with the policymakers, to make sure that they are present in constructing the future for their own country, and to help them to network and be partners in the different platforms that we create, so we can learn from them and they can learn from us. because indeed there is a plenty of things that we can learn from Ukrainians today. We can learn from them the power of voluntarism. I would only tell you that during the war, 80% of people became volunteers in Ukraine. Who can boast of such an army of volunteers as they can? We can really be inspired by their determination to support one another and to defend. We can learn from them how to be resilient and how to be agile, how to act and adapt to the situation regardless what are the circumstances. And we can learn from them how to care about democratic procedure and about democracy, because right now it's 80% of people in Ukraine who believe that democracy is the best system. They are an inspiration for us. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine and without Ukrainians. Absolutely. Martina, can we turn, we're gonna just start the Q&A session because I know time is also short, and there's a number of contributions and questions in the chat box. Martina, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, and without further ado, I'm going to turn to the first question from Nick Dechakuski from the Mod Foundation. He's asking, and I will probably go to Alexandra for this question first. How can outside external funders make sure that the local organizations, so not on the national level, but really local granular level organizations working in policy advocacy, involve local residents and citizens? Because Nick understands that this has been an issue before. So let's start with this from first. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you. We, as a Center for Civil Liberties, are unique from human rights organization in Ukraine because we always involve ordinary people into our work. We had success when we organized a civil initiative Euromaidan SOS during Revolution of Dignity. We brought up several thousands of people to provide legal assistance to persecuted protesters. And only for 3 months of the Revolution of Dignity, we proceed more than 16,000 requests of help. It's worth to mention that before Revolution of Dignity started, we have never provided legal consultancy and legal support to people. We have another goal and strategy as a human rights organization. So I do believe that ordinary people have a much more impact than they can even imagine. And we will never achieve success without involving ordinary people. As I mentioned before, the equalities laws and new formal institution need energy to work in a proper way. And this energy is involvement of people. But how to do it, even based on our own experience, I must admit that donors organizations or other organizations who want to use this approach have to change by themselves. They have to use another communication. They have to be able to explain not with the norms of Universal Declaration or Geneva and Hague Convention things, but a proper way what we are fighting for. And also it needs to change the financial and other administrative procedures. I know that a lot of donors use the approach to work through some intermediaries, not with local organizations and local initiatives, because it's much easier for donors to work in such a way. But I do believe that it's very important to work directly, and it's provide more effective result and more impact to communities and to society in a whole. And like it's very important because it's provide opportunity to allocate all resources to the proper need. We saw sometimes a huge disbalance between in a budget which used for intermediaries and for people who do their work on the ground. And this is also something which has to be taken into account. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. And your last point actually brings me to the second question from Nick Dechakiewski, again from the Mod Foundation. He asked, because that's where we are, many of the founders work through or with intermediaries. Do you have any recommendations for them, like how better engage or work with these intermediaries to make sure that the external assistance is effective, efficient, and impactful? And if Natalie and Delphine have also any recommendations in this regard, feel free to jump in after Alexandra.
Like I mentioned in my previous answer about the problem with disproportional in budget, when sometimes the majority of funds remains in the intermediary and not going to the appropriate needs and goals for which they were allocated for. But also I think that it's very important to develop intermediaries, not like intermediate donors, but as a partners. I will use example. When large-scale invasion started, international organizations and others, donors organizations, sent 1 million consultants to Ukraine. They work with us distantly, and they try to help us how to effectively document and investigate numerous amount of crimes which we faced. But if you have a car without petrol, you can hire the best driver in the world. If you have no petrol, the car will not move. And I want to say that a lot of things wasn't be done by Ukrainians, not because we don't know what has to be done, but because we're lacking the professional hands on the ground. So this is like the difference from approach. Like local partners needs from intermediaries, not just coordination. We need involvement as a partner to achieving the common goal.
Thank you. Delphine, Natalie, would you want to speak for a minute to any of these issues before I turn to one of our participants from Ukraine to join us for the conversation?
Thank you, Martina. I think just building on what Alexandra has said, what we've seen from some of the reports that have come up is that in the first months after the crisis broke, the vast majority of support and action was undertaken by local actors. Yet of the many millions that were pledged and granted to the crisis, only 0.0003% went to those who were actually performing that support. So I think it's a matter of understanding what the needs are in an evolving and protracted crisis, whereby different partners play different roles and need to understand what to do for each other. First and foremost, listening to the needs of the Ukrainians on the ground and understanding how they can be assisted and supported rather than assuming that we know. And I think that that is where a conversation can continue to take place as well.
Yeah, I think for many foundations who perhaps haven't been active funders in the region before, it isn't realistic immediately following a crisis to be able to build relationships or get dollars directly to local organizations. So intermediaries can be a powerful way to make a contribution to the region through a trusted organization without having to find the local connections yourself. But what I think can help you find the right intermediary is also thinking about which intermediaries had existing presence in Ukraine in the region. So they have existing relationships with local organizations that they can leverage in a time of crisis. And so that is an important angle to think about when you're trying to pick which intermediary you might work with. There are a lot of funds that spin up in the moments post-crisis who are then also new to the region. So where are there existing history and relationships that can be leveraged where trust already exists if you cannot make those grants directly yourself and need to work through an intermediary organization? And there are several based in the US, based in Europe. I know both Philea and the Council have lists of those types of intermediaries on our website who can be a really helpful partner for funders.
Thank you, Natalie. With that, I'd like to move to another question from, I believe, Anthony Richter from the OSF. Thank you for the question. Anthony, I'm bringing to the conversation Lyubo Reinchuk, who is the Deputy Director of Zagori Foundation from Ukraine. The organization is a Phila member, if I'm not wrong. The question from Anthony Lyubo is if there is anything being done to identify philanthropies, so private funders, also from other regions, so other than from the regions that are represented on this call today, so beyond Europe and North America, and also feel free, Lyubo, to comment on any points made by the previous speakers. Over to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. I already raised my hand because I have so many to say about the topic. So answering this first question, I can only tell you something regarding our experience because we didn't do much about trying identifying global philanthropies. But what was really helpful was that website that Phila created, for example, because it could be used as a bridge. You could just contact some of those organizations, and frankly speaking, it was not the hard way to telling about what you're going to do or what your reality is, and they were like pushing you into other contacts or trying to connect you with other people that might be useful during your work. And that would happen to us because during the March we were, so before the war we never fundraised, we never got money outside of the family that were founders of our foundation. And when we were reached out by some of the organizations that heard us during this meeting that were organized by Phila or during some coordination meetings with Wings or Candid or I don't know, any other philanthropy association that we were the part of, it was a really big deal because even though they couldn't help us directly, they could meet us with other people. So I think question about mapping and identifying those philanthropies is being the part of some of the community that is still doing something, and then you could find the way to find others that might be useful. For us, it worked the way that, for example, from time to time, we were contacted by people that mentioned several of our partners mentioned that the Zagori Foundation is doing 1, 2, 3 there. So we thought it might be useful to contact you and to see what are the common points or the thing that we might do together. And that was the way how we managed to broad our partnerships and find new partners, find new donors and whatsoever. And also I wanted to add a little bit on intermediaries and about those organizations that might provide those support in Ukraine. And thank you, Alexandra, for mentioning what you did, because that's something we've been advocating for the whole year about supporting locals and that you do not need necessarily support only international organization, because a lot of work being done somewhere in small cities, in the organization that do not know English, that do not know how, they do not have resources to build those partnerships. And for example, we were the small part of those intermediate organizations, but what we did and what I think might be the best way to provide those support is, for example, our foundation could cover the salaries of the staff. So we could use all the money that we got directly to support local organizations by the resources that we got. So we had all the necessary to start grant contests, or we had the contacts and the branch of people that were the part of our contact list, and we knew what was going on. So we knew we had partners in Odessa, Dnipro, Ternopil, Lviv, Ivano-Frankivsk, whatsoever. So we could reach them out and know what the needs are, and not trying to push our agenda, but basically asking what they want to achieve and what they want to do in the next couple of months or a year. And another thing is that not trying to have as many intermediaries as you can imagine. I know several of them. It's like Carpathian Foundation, Jednania, Renaissance Foundation, we as well, and everyone cover a small piece of the whole picture. So I believe that in the future, we need to have those coordination meetings. I'm sorry for meetings again, but still it's something that we can do by knowing who is doing what and how not to duplicate the work and how to define what is basically going on the ground. And maybe the grand content that we've been planning is not that accurate right now. Maybe we need to rethink it according to the last results that any other organization had. And I believe that how to say it correctly, as much support one organization would have from different actors would smaller the amount of administrative costs from one organization, but make more efficient help to the organization that are local ones.
Thank you, Lubo. That was very helpful. I'm afraid I wish I could continue this conversation, and I know that we still have one unanswered question from Adam Holub from the Czech Environmental Partnership on the green recovery. But I will leave it up to Jonathan Katz, our moderator today, to decide if we have time left to respond to that question and see whether Delphine and Natalie would want to comment on that. I will hand it over to Jonathan now to wrap up because we have only 5 minutes left. Again, thank you very much for all your questions.
Martina, thank you. Delphine or Natalie, do either one of you want to address green recovery, or Alexandra? 30-second response. No?
I will
Okay,
try to be very brief. I think that this awful situation can be transferred in future for opportunity for Ukraine to express, to demonstrate success of the green recovery. And I think that it's a very perspective field to work on and to invest the knowledge, time, and resources.
Alexandra, I certainly agree with you, and GMF is focused in this area through our cities program, so it's so important. David, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, let me put on my hat as a physicist on this one and just note that Ukraine is really well positioned to build a very green economy. It has an existing network of nuclear reactors, which are a very important piece of a green sector because the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow. And it can think about, as it rebuilds, an electrified, and it needs to repair its electric grid. One of the many terrible things is the attack on the grid, but that means it's an opportunity, as one thinks about rebuilding, to rebuild not only something that is restoring existing capabilities, but as we look at what economies will need to look at, and this is another area we think about, to be carbon neutral, we will need to have roughly double the electric power we have today and significant enhancements in transmission lines. And I think this is a good example of when we think about the steps in responding, we have to both do things that maintain existing capabilities, make sure the electricity goes through tomorrow, but also be thinking towards the longer term. How do we rebuild a post-war Ukraine that is green, democratic, that will be, at the end, a richer, fuller place than it was even before the war?
David, thank you. Couldn't agree more. We're going to just go to your other colleagues just to do some final quick remarks as well. And Delphine, if I can just turn to you. And please try to keep these short because I know we're running really close to the time allotted for the conversation today. Delphine?
Absolutely, Jonathan. And as mentioned while speaking at the beginning of this conversation, We have, together with the partners and with our partners from Ukraine, and a big thank you to the Zagori Foundation and the International Renaissance Foundation for contributing to this, created a statement that we will invite all of you to sign on to. It is a statement that really expresses the solidarity of philanthropy with Ukraine and with Ukrainians. It's a commitment to supporting Ukrainians, and in particular the vulnerable communities and populations displaced and impacted by the crisis. It's a call to continue supporting accountability, international law, a just and sustainable peace, and focusing on ensuring human rights in the recovery. It's a recognition of the depth and the complexity of the long-term needs that come with the war in Ukraine. And it's a recognition of the importance of transparency, accountability, sustainability, and inclusivity, which we believe we can contribute to as a philanthropic community, connecting it also to the global agenda, to the understanding of the challenges in terms of food security, humanitarian crises that also emerge and increase across the world, climate change, and the supply chains that are disrupted by the economic distress internationally. So this statement has been pre-signed by a number of foundations and organizations so far, and I'd like to thank them for being the first ones to express their solidarity to this statement. The statement itself can be found on our website, and the link to the statement is being posted in the chat as we speak. And to be among those who sign this statement and who endorse the solidarity call for Ukraine, please send us an email at the email address that you will find on this slide, as well as on the website itself. So I hope we'll see many of you signing on to this statement. Again, it is built on everything we've heard the past 12 months and our commitment to continuing the solidarity that is so important for Ukrainians today. Thank you.
Thank you, and I encourage everybody to sign on. Natalie, do you have any final thoughts?
Just a thank you to all of the work that's being done by foundations across both sides of the Atlantic and around the world to remain in solidarity. We were honored to partner with philanthropy networks from Philae to across Canada and across Europe to bring this conversation. And it is clear that philanthropy, as David talked about in his remarks, has a really unique role to play in the crisis. So we urge foundations to consider thinking about how they can support the crisis in Ukraine. And if we can be helpful, please do reach out for how we might help you in that response. Thanks to all for joining.
Thank you. Eva?
I would only add that I was really very pleased to see that in the survey that you conducted and showed us at the beginning, I found them the tips that I wanted to make for the founders. So I think I don't have to make these tips because it's already interiorized. And it really shows that, Alexandra, we are a different herd of animals. We here as private funders, we do understand that one has to be agile, flexible, responsive, close to those that are on the ground and really to empower them and collaborate and take risks. So hopefully we are not looking for any intermediaries. We want to work with the people on the ground, and this is something I really wanted to thank all of us, that we in this group really understand the power of empowering local people.
Okay, thank you. David?
When I think about the role of philanthropy, another important element I think is we should be willing to take on risks. And one of the reasons people are reluctant to work with local groups they haven't worked with before is there's an element of risk. But that's our job. And we need to, this is a crisis, and we need to all figure out the way that within our missions, within our capabilities, we can help Ukraine survive and then rebuild and become a even better place.
David, thank you. Alexandra, I'm going to give you the final word.
I will finish with that fact that Ukraine is need to succeed, but the world also needs success of Ukraine, because success of Ukraine will have a huge impact to the whole region and to democratic future of Russia itself. And that's why when I speak with my Russians human rights colleague and ask them how I can be helpful, because they are labeled as foreign agent, they are jailed, they have led the country, etc., etc. They always responded, if you want to help us, please be successful.
Thank you. That is an important point and note to end on. And Alexandra, I can't thank you enough to everyone today, inspiring on so many levels. But also, I think you've given us a direction for everyone to go, and I do urge everyone to sign on to the statement as appropriate. And we look forward to our next conversation. Eva, Delphine, Natalie, Alexandra, David, thank you so much. I'm not going to go back through all the names of the organizations, but there are so many, but Talea, Council of Foundations, other partners as well, the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Mott, thank you so much. Philanthropic Foundations Canada, Community Foundations of Canada, PECs. I think hopefully I've listed everybody. Delphine, please correct me if I've missed anybody. And just thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a good rest of your day. And I saw what Nick put into the chat box about not having a second anniversary. That means providing support, critical support right now, immediately, and then also thinking longer term, as David and others have pointed out, for Ukraine's reconstruction recovery. So I wish you all a good morning, rest of your morning, and a good afternoon. Thank you.